Welcome back to another episode of the AI Healthcare Podcast. I'm your host, Dylan Reed, and today we are joined with my friend, Dr. Jon Pangia, who's a physician and VP of Clinical AI at Fabric. Dr. Pangia, thank you so much for your time today.
My pleasure. Happy to be here.
No, we're glad you're here. And what got you into the medical profession?
Oh, that goes way back. Honestly, I was a young kid. I went from wanting to be garbage man to police officer to firefighter and then emergency doctor, and then it never changed. So I just became enamored with the idea of being being the one in those situations that could help, right? And I wish I could tell you it was this deep altruistic, urge I had, but the real honesty is that, I just thought it was exciting and fun and really cool to be involved in those situations and be an emergency doctor and help. So that just began a lifelong journey towards healthcare.
And what is the story behind Fabric?
So Fabric is an interesting company in that it began with an idea of wanting to get into the healthcare space, wanting to go help make the process smoother, and thinking of different ways to do it. And then starting with a very small group of people who really were just trying to innovate around that idea of like, how can we help healthcare? And then it turned into an idea of maybe we can use digital healthcare as a software service for hospitals to help patients get in and through the emergency department smoother, with better awareness of what's happening, better follow-up after they were done. And so that became one of their platform products. But then they got some traction and attention for what was a really good idea, as far as I'm concerned. And that led to funding, which led to acquisitions. And so then they started acquiring other companies that were adjacent to that goal. And so they acquired a company that had a virtual care platform, and they acquired a company that used AI machine learning to scrub hospital websites and answer questions about just that hospital website, and to check people's symptoms and see, and give feedback on where that person could get the best care and the best timing. And there's a few other products on top of that go on, but that one beginning then turned into a lot of like, what else can we do to help hospitals and healthcare systems, do a better job, have an easier time taking care of patients and helping them find the information they need and deliver it.
So, from a clinical AI perspective, and kind of you being a physician, you kind of envision Fabric kind of being a one-stop shop for a patient's healthcare needs.
I think being a one-stop shop for someone's healthcare needs in entirety is a very aspirational goal for any company. You look at big companies like Kaiser Permanente, right, which wants to be that. That's what that looks like, where they're trying to be the insurance company, the hospital, the primary care clinics, and all those things, in between, with varying degrees of success. They're probably the largest that one could think of, right? And then after that, there's just different packages. And so Fabric really more envisions themselves as being the all-in digital healthcare solution, right? So not taking over hospital, not providing all the different specialists there, but filling in the gaps, taking the parts that hospitals just generally aren't very good at because they're difficult, and then making that a niche specialty, and then attacking those gaps to help, cover the seams, as you will, through the patient's journey through a healthcare system.
And specifically, kind of, you coming from the medical world, what is the biggest weakness that you see consistently hospitals having?
Well, it's hard to pin down like one big weakness. I think that in general, they're very large, complicated, burdensome beasts.
Mhm.
There's a lot that has to happen for a patient to get care. And when you're talking about a hospital, you're talking about acute healthcare, and that is generally unexpected, unanticipated, bad things have happened. Where it's like, very few things are elective surgeries. And even the elective surgeries aren't that elective when you look at what they're doing. They're usually treating some disease that was found in the last few months. And so by that very nature, it's high stakes. Things are changing. It's incomplete information, and there's an incredible amount of required intercommunication between the patient, the family, the different doctors, the nurses. And so unsurprisingly, you see that, hospitals, when a patient enters a hospital, all the errors that happen, all the confusion is going to come from all those things, where it's just incredibly difficult to nail the bullseye on every single one of those requirements for someone to have a perfect visit in the hospital.
No, that's and that leads into my next question nicely. So the company slogan of Fabric is create more capacity to care. And so what does that mean to you as someone who is from the medical background, and how has that jump started your work in R&D on LLMs in patient facing medical software?
Right. And that's really why I quit the job I had gotten very good at over 16 years and jumped into Fabric, because they're doing something I thought was really important and was not being done very well anywhere else. And that's taking away the low skill requirement tasks
Mm-hmm.
from the people with this very hard earned skill set and experience, where too often we have a physician, for example, who has spent 8 years getting to the point where they can even practice on their own, and that 8 years I mean after college, so really 12 years of training just to get to the point where they can practice. That's a very large skill set to earn, and they are then busy. But then you turn around, you see what they're doing data entry. They're chasing down things that anyone can do, and we looked at what Fabric could do in digital health, and it was, why don't we do these things? It's not even new technology. It's very old technology. Why don't we leverage this to help the people get the things they need to just then focus on the things that only they can do? And so it has products that, it takes the medical history from the patient. And so when the patient shows up in front of the doctor for evaluation and treatment, all the questions I needed to ask about their chief complaint are answered in a way that's reliable, because we built these really, really strong protocols from the best evidence-based medicine, the best standard of care. So we took the best practices. And now, as a medical director too, I don't ever have to worry about any of my clinicians forgetting to ask a very important question. We've got it built into the software. It's going to be asked already. And so it's just more and more things like that, where what do we have a nurse doing that they don't need to be doing, right? That we can have someone else, or in this case, something else, do for them. And that's increasing that capacity. So now we're spending all this time, all this money, it's heartache, energy to get to a certain level of training. And now we can have people more and more just do that they were trained to do, and not all the other stuff that I don't want to say isn't a good use of their time, but it can be done by other people who didn't have to earn such a hard and high level of training.
Mm-hmm. And what would you say is kind of the ratio of medical professionals kind of doing administrative tasks versus actually, you know, speaking with the patient about treatments and kind of what are the next steps for them to actually get there?
It's a great question. It's been measured, I think, many different ways, and so I think there's many different numbers. But I can tell you, the amount of time spent talking to a patient, and during that conversation, getting the relevant medical information you need, and then actually charting it, communicating the plan, talking, to the other people that have to be part of that plan. The actual patient interaction is probably as low as 10 to 15%, right? Especially when you include that pertinent, like, the physician, the clinician explaining to the patient what they need to know, helping them understand. That part is unfortunately like the smallest part of what is being done. And it is probably the most impactful part. And it's the part that patients care about the most, is understanding what's happening with them and what they need to do.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, because it's, just amazing to me just learning about kind of in the healthcare space. It's like they go, a patient goes to the doctor gives them a treatment plan, and then it's like, have fun, figure it out on your own.
Unfortunately, it ends up being that a lot of times. And, as I'll often remind people in the medical profession, the word doctor is derived from ancient Greek word for teacher. which is
And
why PhDs are called doctors, right? And physicians are medical doctors. And so it just helps remember that, like, hey, the most important part of what we're doing is communicating what's happening, teaching our patients and their family what's going on with them and what they need to do, because any doctor can prescribe a treatment, but the patient's got to see it through and they have to understand why it's important and how to do it well.
mhm. And to shift the conversation a little bit, so as a physician, how is clinical oversight done pre-AI?
Yeah, it hasn't changed terribly much right now, to be honest. Medical oversight. So you go for over physicians in general, right? There's typically going to be a medical director. That's not always true. That's only true in really hospital-based groups. If you go to a surgeon's office, there's only one person there. That's that surgeon. And if there's three surgeons, they tend to not be looking over each other's shoulders and giving feedback, right? Unless it was asked. And so that oversight is going to be reliant on very, very low amount of oversight. That's complaints to the state board if some patient didn't like what they saw, or really just complaint driven to whomever. But there's really nobody over them per se. You get to the hospital, you have a chief medical officer who can collect and bring feedback to the clinicians on the medical staff. But again, that's usually complaint driven. Sometimes the hospital will have metrics, so measurements of quality that they'll deliver back, and that's a form of oversight. And then you get to larger groups where there tends to be a medical director. This is going to be emergency medicine groups, hospitalist groups that work inside the hospital as internal medicine doctors. So those medical directors, they're not doing chart audits typically. They're going to, again, be looking at quality measurements and giving feedback to those physicians. They're going to be going after complaints from nurses, from administrators, from patients, where, someone, might come to me and say, hey, Dr. Pangia, this patient said that you gave them the wrong treatment. And then you sit down and review the case, right? And try to validate the complaint or invalidate or what have you. Now, when you get to APCs, advanced practice clinicians, so that's your physician assistants and nurse practitioners, that varies between groups and states. Some state medical boards require that a certain percentage of charts be audited by the medical director. And so, for example, that's one thing I do at Fabric is I'm one of several physicians that will just go through the charts. I go through the care that was delivered, review the chart, give feedback to the clinician on things I thought were done well or could have been done differently. That's a general spectrum of oversight. As we get into AI, again, there still is not a terrible amount of AI being deployed this way. But, for example, although it's not the traditional concept of AI, like Fabric uses automated oversight, right? I have antibiotic adherence criteria. So where I can see if a clinician, how many times, what percentage of times that they see somebody with a cough cold that didn't really need antibiotics, that they were given antibiotics anyway. And I can track it that way. So that makes my job much easier as a medical director to provide oversight without having to go pick through charts and read them one by one, just trying to see if I find any discrepancies that need to be addressed.
So it's um, so you're kind of really starting kind of specifically with Fabric, kind of from the ground up and totally overhauling clinical oversight.
I wouldn't say overhauling it because we're really just automating things that were being done already.
Mm.
Before I was with Fabric, I was still, I was a medical director, and I had to go find my quality metrics a different way. I had to go process spreadsheets, and this is how I got into AI. I got into data science in general because I found that the data processing wasn't being done very well at all, at least not to my, to my needs, and so I was kind of forced into figuring out how to do it better myself. Yeah, we're moving towards an era where we can more and more just automate these things and make it easier and easier for the experts to provide that expert medical oversight.
Mhm. And how would you like physicians to be contributing to the greater AI healthcare conversation?
Mm. Yeah, I have seen through my, I don't know if to call it short or whatever career. I've been a physician for 20 years. I've been practicing emergency medicine specifically for almost all that time. And, What I've seen is a lot of tools created by people who are not practicing physicians or physicians at all that just weren't useful, right? It was a lot of wasted time, effort, and resources to usually try to do a better job than I was doing, which is fine. I'd love to see it. That'd be great. One less thing I have to do for another condition. But in general, they were just kind of replicating my efforts. And, what I really needed was something else. There's certain things that I can't do well, that I don't have great oversight on. And I think as we look at this new era, we're looking at these large language models in particular are just becoming easier and easier to use. And you can go back to the early 1900s and you'll find, quite a few of the best surgeons were down in the basement when they weren't in the operating room, forging their own tools, making exactly what they needed to solve the problem in front of them. And so now here we are with AI, and it's kind of becoming the new, basement blacksmith, shop, because now a doctor can say, you know what I really need? I'm like, well, great, go build it, right? Here's how you do prompt engineering. Here's how you build these things. And then once you have a good working, series of prompts that helps the LM do the job that you need, and then building an API wrap around it is very easy. And that's cheap and easy. So we're entering an era where if the physicians more and more start paying attention to stuff and experimenting with it, we're going to start having more and more tools that are actually very, very helpful for us to get the job done.
And you bring up an interesting point, because you're starting to see specifically, in healthcare organizations, well, specifically AI healthcare organizations, it seems like doctors are starting to play much more of a business executive role within an organization.
Quite. Because they had to. I don't know if it was a real quote, but I remember watching a show about John Adams where he said, if good men don't go into politics or go into government, others will, right? And I would say the same thing about healthcare is that, if practicing physicians who understand the patient journey better than anyone else don't get involved in the business side and the management of these healthcare systems, others will, and they certainly have. And so what we have is, accountants running hospitals very, very well from a financial standpoint. But we see time and time again really large discrepancies in the clinical quality, the clinical understanding of what it takes to operate the hospital. And so, it's one of those things where if you really want it done well, you're going to have to figure out to do it yourself. And so it's very, very difficult for someone to go get expertise in medical practice. But it is a lot less difficult. It's not easy, but it's a lot less difficult for someone to get training and understanding of business management. And so you see a lot more physicians with MBAs like myself who said, hey, enough is enough. I need to do a better job on the business side because I'm struggling. I'm struggling at getting these important medical concepts, these important medical issues sorted in a way that is going to be successful. And I don't want to get into what's a better way to run an economy, but we're in a capitalist economy, which means that you have to make sure you're extracting value what you're doing. The good news there is that doing a good job as a clinician, as a clinical healthcare system is profitable, and so as long as you're doing it really well, you don't have to worry about the back end. I've always found that taking really good care of the people who are taking really good care of the patients, all other problems are sorted, right? That you don't have to worry about income. You don't have to worry about staying solvent if you're just doing a good job. The rest of it is just being responsible for the money that you bring in.
And you bring up an interesting point, because I remember reading a book, and there is this push now for private equity groups to buy up these medical practices. And I was reading the book said that this is something that's not new, that it's been they tried it in the 90s and it basically failed miserably. And so it seems like, that we're basically recycling kind of old ideas to figure out ways on how we can make medical practices and healthcare organizations run more effectively and efficiently, kind of like you were alluding to.
Yeah, the fun thing about private equity getting into healthcare is that, it's actually really difficult to make a huge profit. And that's really all private equity wants to do. And you can go out there and I'm usually disappointed when we just lump all these different companies into some, one term private equity, because what I've seen is a wide variety of how they go about making their investments. That said, when you look at, for example, like buying up physician groups and then providing physician services, the big problem they run into is skilled physicians are in short supply, which means you have to pay them at the market rate or higher to have them, which means you have a very thin profit margin. When you have a company, now, normally in the 80s and 90s, a physician starts a practice, they're going to expect something like 40% overhead. 40% overhead was kind of like, you got to pay the rent, you got to pay the lights, you got to pay your staff. And now you look at these, large contract management groups and a really large physician services group, they're not surviving if they have an overhead more than 15%. And you add to that more and more the insurance companies, who very much control our healthcare system, whether they say they do or don't, the reality is they do. They're trying not to pay. And so you have this downward pressure on physician rates. You have this upward pressure on the supply. And then you have private equity come in and thinking they're going to make a profit. And you're like, all right, guys, I'd like to see how you do it. Because the reality is you just can't take too many shortcuts. Is there waste in the healthcare system? Absolutely. Is there waste in the physician services? Well, I haven't seen them pull much out successfully. And then you get the bad stories where private equity, getting desperate, starts to do things that are, some would declare unethical. I will reserve my judgment, right? And just tell you that, when they start doing the balance billing, which was really, let's push onto the patient. That was unethical. I'll go out and say it, on both the side of the companies doing it and the insurance companies letting it happen. And we have good data now to show discovered emails and communication of some large insurance companies. They did it on purpose. They purposely stuck the bill on the patient so they could keep more of the money. And so once again, trying to see private equity survive in that very red ocean is really, I think most of them are just trying to get out of it right now. It's not the 5x profit that they're used to having.
Yeah. And it's nothing new either. Like that, they've tried it before.
Yeah. And then there's a whole lot of other things you can try to do, but it's got to be done safely. And so, we're finding more and more clinical protocols that are really well vetted, well researched, and we can take things and we can lower the skill level required to take care of these patients. I think the best example is someone presenting to the emergency department with chest pain. That used to be very difficult, physician only level. There was a certain percentage that you just didn't know. They were giving you no evidence that they were going to have a huge, major cardiac event in the next 6 weeks, and so we just had to try to do our best, and it was a very, very difficult decision making. Since in the last 10 years, they came out with a really, really well-studied risk stratification scoring tool that knocked out something like 20% of these patients and said, like, these guys are really low risk. You can safely send them home. And the rest, let's protocolize a plan. Well, now a patient comes to the emergency department with chest pain. A physician will look at the EKG to make sure it's not a emergency, go to the cath lab now, heart attack. After that, the PA can handle it because it's very protocolized, very easy to do. And so what we've done is we've effectively lowered the skill level on what used to be a very, very high skill level condition. But that comes with time, physicians doing studies and research. It does not come with a private equity company coming in and saying, we're going to move as much of the care as we can down to PAs because they're cheaper. It just doesn't work that way, right? There's a skill set that they're comfortable doing. And the problem with trying to get cheaper clinician labor is that although there's some really, really smart PAs out there that I would put above many doctors I know, you can only have a plan for the lowest skill set, lowest experienced and comfortable PA, because if they're going to work there, you can't have them out, over their head, clinically speaking. And so that becomes very difficult to execute. And it's just not a solvent plan for these private equities companies to come in and say, we're going to push more and more to the PAs.
Yeah. And, kind of what you were saying, that if you push a lot of the activity onto cheaper clinician labor, don't you also potentially run into lawsuits? Because if they have to do something that they're not skilled or certified to do, then that's a whole other nightmare that you have to deal with.
Right. Anyone going, well, so the funny thing about advanced practice clinicians and nurse practitioners and PAs is that, they don't have, I should say, they don't normally, on average, have specialty certification training, right? There's a certain subcategories that they all look at certified in, right? But then they can go into many different specialties. And so a PA can say, I don't want to do emergency medicine anymore. I want to be a neurosurgery PA. And they just up and move. And they go over, next month to go do that. And they learn on the job. A physician, I mean, you wouldn't even match to the residency program coming out of 8 years emergency medicine to go do 7 years neurosurgery. Like, it's just not done that way. And so they actually are a lot more flexible. But then they have to only operate within the scope of practice of their experience and their supervising physician at if it's applicable. And so, does it increase the liability? Liability, I think it's a different discussion than competency. It really is. It can be a whole other podcast if you like. But in general, it's rare for a physician assistant nurse practitioner to venture far outside of their scope of training. And so I would tell you the liability, or rather safety, only comes up with, you just do it right, right? There's a certain percentage of a margin of error, if you will. Nobody anywhere ever is going to hit 100% accuracy, right? And that's just a fact. It's just math. And so, we just try to minimize error by doing it a very, very consistent way. But that brings us back to things like, companies like Fabric and others like it that are saying, well, how much of this can we protocolized? How many guardrails can we realistically build that'll help lower the skill set required to, ingest this clinical situation and come out with the right answer consistently?
Mm-hmm. And, to change gears back to Fabric, so where would you see Fabric playing a role kind of in the greater AI healthcare conversation, or where would you like to see the organization go from as the VP of clinical AI?
It's really hard to look farther than 2 years right now, which is crazy, right? To say I can't see more than 24 months in the future, but it was only 2 years ago that ChatGPT came out, right? And we completely changed the AI landscape.
It's only been 2 years?
It was, let me see, something like that, right? Yeah, maybe 3 years coming up this November, but max 3 years, man. And it just barely got started.
Wow.
And it completely changed your understanding. And now, now you have Gemini and Llama and, all these really, really strong models being released. And, they'll release a model and it'll be the best on the market. And then the other one, then ChatGPT does their new release, and then that's the best in the market. And they just keep one-upping each other. And so I don't know where we're going to be 24 months from now, how useful these tools are going to be. I just know they're going to be very useful. Now, as far as where Fabric goes with it, we keep playing the safe bet, I think, because there's so much low-hanging fruit that we could spend our entire career just going after the safe, low-hanging fruit, and we might not ever get to the end of it, right? Because it's just, there's too much that can be done right now with just very simple solutions, because that's how complicated and difficult the healthcare system is, right? We have no shortage of problems to solve. Yeah. And what we're doing now and where I see us going over the next few years is just one at a time, saying, what are we doing today? How can we improve this? Does AI have a tool that's going to help us get to where we need to be? We're doing R&D on several different AI tools. Almost all of them right now are just using large language models because it's easy, because it sells, because it solves too many problems right now for us to ignore it. But there's still discussion of long-term, positioning ourselves to be ready to go back to doing, some of the more traditional AI approaches of, doing local search on graphs and decision trees, random forest, all these different cool tools to make diagnostic inferences, to do clinical decision rule support. We're just more and more able to, prepare to bring in these more complicated but potentially more impactful tools in the near future.
And my last question, Dr. Pangia, is what do policymakers need to understand about LLMs when enacting policies that directly impact medical software?
Yeah, it's really difficult. I think we need to acknowledge that policy and regulations exist to keep bad players at bay, right? There's just too many people out there who are too willing to enrich themselves at the rest of the nation's expense. And so therefore we need policies, regulations, and law. On the other side of that, when we try to regulate something that is growing quickly, some element of science, we tend to do a really poor job. And so as we're looking at what the policymakers need to know is, listen, you can't have vague policies that are restrictive because they're impossible to interpret and they lead to huge conflict down the road. At the same time, you also can't get too specific because it's changing rapidly. One of the problems we run into with FDA clearance is the FDA is going to, look at something, your AI tool that you've created that they've decided is a medical device. Fair game, right? Like I get that. It's impacting clinical care. It needs to have some kind of oversight. I agree. Unfortunately, we run into a big problem where AI continues to improve itself. So if I have an AI model, I get it approved. Well, a year later, I take all the data we have, I retrain my model, I improve the performance. Well, now it's no longer FDA approved. I've modified it. Right. And so there's certain problems with these policies where they don't adapt well as we improve, which means now we're hampering, inhibiting our progress, and we're making ourselves less successful. And so it's these policies and regulations. Sometimes I wonder if there's not a better way to do it, where why don't we just do a better job of going after the bad players instead of writing a script of rules that have to be followed that will be obsolete in 12 to 24 months.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. And that's something, you bring up an interesting point that, I actually, so I don't really say my opinions much on podcasts, but I will say I would even go as far as arguing that agencies and Congress have already lost the battle when it comes to AI, because from a regulatory and a legislative standpoint, it just takes such a long time. Well, first of all, to come up with the idea, then for you to gather support, then for you to write it, and then for you to vote, legislatively, and then or get it enacted on the regulatory side. So, and that could take a good 12 to 15 years. And, you being a VP of clinical AI at Fabric, technology changes very quickly. So it's
by the quarter. we're at an age right now where every 3 months, what you knew 3 months ago is mostly untrue now. So yeah, it's nuts. And also you add to that when government policy, becomes, an issue, they tend to look for industry experts. Well, a lot of times what you see is the huge, big financial players showing up and then dictating policy, curving it into their favor, which further inhibits innovation and further inhibits smaller companies to succeed. And so it just backfires in many ways. I'm not advocating against policymaking, to be clear. I'm not. It's very difficult to do well, though.
Mm-hmm. Definitely. And Dr. Pangia, where can people find more about you as well as Fabric?
So we're at fabrichealth.com. It's a simple URL right there. And about me, you'll find me on the website. You'll find me on LinkedIn. There's not much else out there that's interesting for me.
Awesome. And be sure to subscribe to the AI Healthcare Podcast YouTube channel, as well as listen to the audio version of this podcast on Spotify and Apple Podcasts. Dr. Pangia, thank you so much for your time today.
Thank you. It's been a pleasure.
This is Dylan Reeds